me. I've got lots of different screens open. Um, First, I want to welcome you all for taking time out of your precious schedules for this rather odd presentation. I myself call it curious. It's fun for me to do this, and I appreciate your taking an interest in it. I think you'll certainly know more about something before we're done, and I think you'll be equally curious about this historical anomaly that I'm going to describe, because it always has surprises for me. I'm really happy to be able to do this, and it's actually really good that I'm doing this through Zoom because it's really much easier to do this through Zoom. I made presentations in person for years to all kinds of groups, and it's much easier to sit down at a computer and not have to worry about projectors and stuff like that. I want to thank Shari Shemayim for sponsoring this and publicizing it. It's interesting to note that Rabbi Diamond heard early versions of this research in the early 80s when we were all much younger in a different world. That research culminated in a master's degree, and more importantly, it ignited a love for this little piece of Torah that has lasted many decades. Some of you, maybe many of you, have heard all or some of this over the years. At Shabbos lunch or a walk home from shul. Some people have even read chapters of the book that this will all one day become as testers. But few people have, few people have seen even half of what I have to show you in these presentations. There's quite a bit more research that's keeping that area of my life alive. And so without further ado, I want to move to more interesting things. I'm going to share the screen again and begin the presentation in a moment. Okay, in a moment. There we are. So I've called this the curious history of the inverted nuns because it really is a very curious story. In theory, what I'm going to speak about and demonstrate in these presentations about the evolving shape and location of the markings that you see on the screen should not really be possible. But nevertheless, in front of you on the screen, you see two images of two Sifrei Torah that are from different places and different times. They're separated by maybe 400 years, but they are different. I can point out many, many differences, especially in the issue of the nuns between these two. You can see the two squiggly things in the left-hand image, and the more bracket-like designs on the right-hand side. That's exactly what we're talking about. That's the whole point of this, that over 2,000 years of our history, as most everything has evolved, so did the design and shape and location of these markings. That's what I'm going to speak about for the next couple of hours over the next few weeks. If you have questions or comments to make, please put them in the chat, and I'll get to them later, before 8, and we'll have some time after 8 because I'm not going anywhere. So the next thing I want to show you is what this presentation is not about. It's not about the nun moth, which happens to carry on its back inverted nuns, so to speak, nor is it the inverted nun presented in the right-hand image. And if you go to the internet, there are actually a couple of people who have pictures like that dressed up as nuns in their habits. That's not what we're talking about. I can't tell you how many times I've heard the joke about the inverted nuns, the perverted nuns. I've heard it all. But we are talking about this. You're seeing in front of you a Sefer Torah in our community that has the text of Numbers 10, 35, and 36 surrounded by markings. I'm not going to call them inverted nuns now because I think that's a bit of a misnomer, as you'll see later. The markings surround the text that you see at the bottom of the screen, which we say when we take out the Sefer Torah, Vayihi b'nso ha'aron, and when we put back the Sefer Torah, we say Uvnu Chayomar. That's all pretty standard. The 85 letters between the markings are really not much of a concern to me, and you'll find out why. I am studying an idea here and its expression through time. The idea is that there are markings around this text, and they've been there for a very, very long time. The history is the appearance and adoption of new designs, different locations, and new and innovative interpretations for the markings. Every generation literally made its mark on the history of this tradition. This is a study of the relevant literature, traditional Jewish sources, and graphical evidence from scrolls, codices, and printed books. It's focused on this one really picayune, unique phenomena, 2,000 plus years of a rabbinic analysis of even such a minute phenomena produces a significant amount of information that I've been accumulating and commenting on for 40 years. There's a little bit of Midrash, there's a little bit of Talmud, a little bit of Bible, a little bit of everything else that is in our tradition, and there is lots of images, and I'm letting people in as we go. And so this study would fall into a category of Jewish studies known as Massoretic studies. There'll be more about that in a moment. It's the study of the text of the Hebrew Bible. Now, that there is a history to the text of the Hebrew Bible is a question in some people's minds, but I'll deal with that in a moment. This is an unfinished tale. It's a tale which I was told by quite a few in those days, that it could not be told, that the Torah has not changed, they said, and there's certainly not evidence to be had for what I'm trying to show. It's letter perfect by tradition. Scribes never changed a thing. But the books always told a different tale. That led to 40 years of discovering, reading, and probing our tradition for clues, evidence, statements about these markings. The internet and the pandemic were very, very good for my research. My search for evidence has never been fruitless. Everywhere I've looked, I have found some tidbit that's incorporated somewhere in my work. This goes far beyond presenting or comparing traditional overviews of the comments of several Bible commentaries. There is so much parshanut incorporated in the larger work, but I only bring it in where it's relevant to the history of the markings, their design, and position. The presentations I'm making are going to quickly establish the fundamentals about the markings from rabbinic texts. There's about 1,000 years of material of rabbinic texts, and then I'll present and discuss images to the latter 1,000 years of the history of the text. I'm trying to let some more people in. There's far more than I can present in 2 sessions, and the research goes on. This presentation actually has relevant materials that I've only uncovered in recent weeks. Please understand, my goal has never been to determine the theological message entailed in the bigger text or in the markings. My goal was to document the evolution of this scribal phenomena and the accompanying discussion about the design and position of the markings. So, here we go. There is such a thing as the history of the Bible text. It's been in our hands since we got the text at Sinai. That means mistakes, errors, and traditions are bound to occur and accrue to the text and its accompanying traditions. Our Torah is preserved incredibly well over thousands of years, but our literature shows that there were always issues being discussed and fixes were made. This science of literature is not much studied today. as there's been so little need to focus on the Masoretic text, the words and letters, over the last few hundred years because of printing houses and editors. Since 1949, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, there's been an explosion of work in the area of the history of the text. Unbelievable amounts of work done in 50 years. All the sources and references that I'm going to bring are bona fide Jewish sources. They can be found in good libraries, and the vast majority are available online, including the images you're going to see. All of it is online. All of the opinion, and this is a really important point for everyone to remember, all of the important opinions about this topic that I'm going to show you were expressed by practicing what we call today frum Jews, the most learned rabbis and scribes. Their goal always was produce the best text possible. The text which Hashem gave to us on Sinai was the goal for perfection. When I speak about changes made to the Torah regarding the Nuns, I'm not referencing or presenting a theory of modern Bible scholarship. I'm reading traditional texts which tell a curious tale of changes made to the markings around this text, and they constitute an evolution of this text. All of the changes and modifications to text which I show were surely made with the approval of local rabbis and scholars, just as the following things I'm going to mention were. We already know about history of the text subtopics like Kri and Ktiv, different spellings of words that you see in your everyday Chumash and Shul on Shabbat. There's the story of 3 scrolls which were in the temple, and each one of them had a mistake that got corrected, but based on the other 2. We know about Tikkun Sofrim, where rabbis changed for editorial purposes, seemed to have changed for editorial purposes, words and phrases in the Torah. There's the Nun of Haran, which Rashi says is upside down, and no Sefer Torah that you and I have ever seen has that Nun turned upside down. There's much written about all of this. There's all of the larger and smaller and oddly shaped letters in the Sefer Torah. There are dotted Bible texts in 10 places in the Sefer Torah that have an interesting piece to say about the history of the text. There's all of the other texts that parallel our texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's the differences between the Talmud versions of verses and the Tanakh version of verses, where they don't agree with each other over thousands of years. And of course, there's what is called the inverted Nuns. All of these are little pieces of the history of the text of the Hebrew Bible that have been accumulating over many, many years. We've all wrapped it up now in a package, and we see a very broad history. I've mentioned the Massorah a couple of times. You're probably familiar with the Massorah notation system, which started around 500, near the close of the Talmudic era, where Chazal, our scholars, realized that in order to preserve the pristine text of the Torah, they needed to record all the oddities and anomalies and differences between words that appeared here and there. So these notes in between the columns and at the top and bottom of the page are really a very interesting insight into the history of the text, because they preserve a record of what they saw in their texts based on an accounting of spelling anomalies. There's a whole science to that. It's a huge area of research today, but it gives us insight into this tradition. It ends up with what we now call the Masoretic text. That is the official text of the Hebrew Bible. Now, when you go to look for a Tanakh, you generally don't have to ask for a particular version of the words and letters that are in there, but you can buy different versions of the Holy Scriptures based on different manuscripts. The kosher one for us is called the Masoretic text, because the Masoretes were the scholars who made up the notation and kept the text within a system of perfection. Our story starts way, way back in the MISHNA with some explicit text. The rest The next few slides are all rabbinic texts that give us the foundation pillars of this whole story. The Mishnah, I'm not going to read the Hebrew text. You can do that on your own, or I can provide you with the sources. For ease of presentation and comprehension, I'm going to do most of this in English. So the Mishnah says that the 85 letters of this text defile the hands. That's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. Defiles the hands in the Mishnah means it's a holy text because it transfers tuma, impurity, to the hands. I'm not going to get into the whole issue of why and what, but the Mishnah says this is a very special text because even though it's 85 letters long, if it's divorced from the Sefer Torah, it is still holy. There's an inherent holiness. The reason for that, I'll speak of in a moment. But the earliest text we have, the earliest text of Jewish law, the earliest recorded literature of our people, besides the Torah, says something very special about this text. The Gemara continues and tells us that God himself made these markings, they're called signs, simniot, in the Torah, above and below this text, to tell us that this is not its place. That means that Chazal had an idea that this text was transposed. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, no slouch, he himself says that it's marked because it's considered an independent book. That rolls over in the Gemara's discussion to Rabbi Yonatan's opinion that there are 7 books in the Sefer Torah, Bereshit, Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar divided into 3 books up until 1035, and the 4th book, the 5th book would be Numbers 1035 and 36. The 6th book is the last part of Numbers after 11:1, and the 7th book is Devarim. So there's this notion in the ancient world that it's not 5 books, it's 7 books, or it's 5 books divided up into 7 parts, but it's not one uniform 5 books in the Sefer Torah. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says something extremely controversial at the bottom here. He says it's marked because in the future, this text will be uprooted from here and put in its proper place, which is to say, if we stay alive long enough, you will see another edition of the Sefer Torah, which is a very radical statement, but it's here from Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So the Gemara is quite explicit that there are 4 theories. It's either a misplaced text, and that's why it's marked. It's an independent text, and that's why it's marked. We'll talk about being an independent text in a minute. It delineates a section that's got to be moved somewhere to another place. There was a scribal problem, and our version needs a fix. And it was put here to interrupt the context of the story, meaning it came from somewhere else. Why did it land here? Because God didn't want to give the Torah with 2 stories of calamities in a row. There are 2 stories where Bnei Yisrael get punished, and seemingly this text is inserted in there to make it more literarily, to be more literarily sensitive to us. So there are 4 rabbinic theories here. The most interesting one is that it's an independent text and it's marked. Because the notion that there are 7 books here means that there was something going on that we don't understand, and something very special happened to this text that necessitated it being marked so the scribe would note that. As an aside, what I think happened was this text was incorporated into our Torah because it was thought to be holy. It happened to have got put in the wrong place, and the markings were to tell the sofer who next copied the Torah that it should be put in its proper place. I'll be able to show that more clearly later. I want to go backwards in time now a few hundred years to show you the precursors of this phenomenon. These signs, the sigma and anti-sigma, which look different down in the text that I stole here from Google, a C and a backward C, dotted or not dotted, were used in ancient Hellenistic scribal schools to mark a text that was in an incorrect position. When you're copying scrolls, it's really easy. Your eye strays, you put the pen down in the wrong place, your eye follows the word, and you end up transposing a text. You can imagine in last week's Parsha in Shul, there were so many repetitious paragraphs, it would be easy to get the wrong details in a paragraph that looked like the one that you hadn't written yet. That's what these markings are there to show. There's a problem in this text. It's out of place. It's out of line. It needs to go somewhere else. And these markings were used in ancient texts like this. Here you see a 10th century copy of Homer. And the markings I'm speaking about from the Hellenic world are right there and there, but top left and bottom right, surrounding the text that is problematic. This is a classic Hellenistic editorial or diacritical mark that seems to have been incorporated into our Torah by Chazal because it's there for this exact purpose. They are an editorial sign indicating that the line so marked is at an incorrect position, exactly what the Gemara says is going on here. This is a picture of the oldest copy of Sefer Vayikra from the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's old enough to be in Paleo Hebrew. Our tradition says that Ezra in the 5th century BC changed us into the script we're familiar with. This copy of Vayikra is, at least script-wise, very, very old. And in it, lo and behold, is a transposed text, meaning a piece of Vayikra that we know about is in the wrong place, and it ends exactly here where the arrow is, and that arrow is pointing to this circular anti-sigma shaped mark with a dot in it. The purpose of this is exactly what Chazal said, she'ein ze mekoma. This is not its place. So all this is just evidence that Chazal knew what the Greeks did when a text was misplaced by a scribe. They say that clearly in our literature, and there is the earliest, what I call the earliest inverted nun that anyone's ever seen. Sifrei Bamidbar is a standard rabbinic midrash on Sefer Bamidbar, and it says that there are signs before and after this text because this is not its place. That's my translation. Many people would say that nakud alav milmala umilmata means it's dotted before and after because this was not its place. It's true that nakud means dotted. It's true that there are dotted words in the Chumash and Tanakh, but it's clear to me at least that this really isn't dotted. It means it was marked, because that makes much more sense given Chazal's understanding of what's going on here. So that's my understanding. Nakud means marked. It makes it a lot easier to figure this out. But the dotted tradition, as I show you here in pictures that I promised, continues for many hundreds of years. The bottom right image of inverted nuns with dots is from the 15th century. But the earliest copies of the Tanakh that are official and corrected are up here on the top left. The London Codex, the Washington Bible, the Leningrad Codex, all seem to have a dotted character. The 14th century Bible and the 13th century Bible on the bottom row are also dotted. This 11th century document at the top right, which I'll speak more about in a minute, is also dotted. Clearly, dotted markings were a thing for a very long time, and then they disappear. You'll see that yourselves soon. So here's a range of designs as well. notice how different these designs are from each other and from what you see in the Sefer Torah today. That's part of the evolution, how and why. Now, granted, many of these look the same as each other, but they all have subtle differences that contribute to the history of this. Masechet SOFRIM is the next document, a standard rabbinic work. It's actually sort of an addendum, minor tractate to the Babylonian Talmud in every Jewish library. And it says that a scribe must provide a space for the section beginning Vayihi b'nso Ha'aron, because it's an independent book. That's what was said earlier in the Talmud. It's a book unto itself. It's one of 7. Now, obviously this tradition is continuing. I'm going to focus in on what the scribe is said to be required to do. He must provide a space for the section beginning. Now, upon first reading of that 40 years ago, I said, oh, that makes perfect sense. This is a new book of the Bible, so just like before Sefer Vayikra, there's a space of a few lines, or between sections, paragraphs of the text, there's space. This new book needs to have a space before Vayihi b'nso Ha'aron, because it's an independent book. But further research into the footnotes and the scientific apparatus of this Masechet SOFRIM showed me that it was not clear that the word was a space at the beginning of Vayihi b'nso Ha'aron, because one of the texts says shipur, which is, by dictionary definition, something trumpet-shaped, like shofar. And lo and behold, there's a third manuscript that says that he has to make a shofar, which is what Chazal would call something that was crescent-shaped. It's easily recognizable. It's a shofar shape. So now you have a Talmudic text, Talmudic-era text, telling us that there's got to be something round-ish, like a sigma, an anti-sigma, in front of Vayihi b'nso Ha'aron. But you still have texts like MIDRASH MISHLÉ, another rabbinic text, which tells us that whether it's above or below, this text is dotted. Again, nakud. Or is it marked? So there's equal amounts of evidence for all of this. We've seen dotted texts. We've seen texts that don't have a dot. They have another marking. The plot thickens. We're only at about the 8th century now. Now, here's another quote continuing from Midrash Mishlei. Rebbe says, Sefer Haya Bifnei Atzmo, this was an independent text, v'nignaz. And there's scholarly and rabbinic discussion about what that means. The two sides are clearly at opposite ends of the spectrum. One side says v'nignaz means this was an independent book and it was taken out of circulation. The nefarious story would be it was too hot to handle and they had to put it in a cave somewhere to get it away from people. I think that means it just got worn out and was put away, as would happen with any book. That's what the Cairo Geniz is all about. But the other scholarly opinion says that this means that this was an independent text and it needs to be properly archived when it's not in use, in condition for use. Meaning it's holy enough, it's got a provenance that says it's kosher and 100%, and it, if you find it by itself, needs to be archived properly. That's a whole important piece here. I want to take you back to the Mishnah, where the Mishnah said that this text was special and it was defiling the hands. Ultimately, that means, and I'm painting a picture here of how this happened. I think what happened is there was once an 85-letter scrap of parchment scroll hanging around the writing room somewhere in Qumran. I don't know where this was. It was from a holy scroll, but it was animal chewed, burned, torn beyond use, worn out, except that there were these 85 letters. So the question came up, is this short text, this independent text, kosher, holy, worthy of preserving, or can I put it in the trash or use it for another scroll? And the answer came back 85 letters, like Vayihi bin Soha Ha'aron and Sefer Bamidbar, is the minimum, the paradigm for the smallest number of letters that keep a scroll kosher. I think that led to that text being preserved in a scroll. What better way to preserve it than to write it into a scroll? Remember, the book called Treyasar 12 is one scroll of 12 books, so there's a model for that happening. And you end up with this text being preserved but marked as special because it has a special provenance. That's what I think the science behind this is. Pieces of it are provable, pieces out of it are conjecture, but the Nignas proves the point that they considered this text very special and what we call holy. And now a very interesting aside. There's this rather esoteric but published midrash called Chaserot v'Yater, which means letters that are missing and letters that are added. And it's a Massoretic work of anomalies in the text. And it says that there are two verses in the Sefer Torah where there are inverted nuns, which are from the prophecies of Eldad and Medad. And some say that the inverted nuns teach that there was a withdrawn book, Sefer Ganuz. So the withdrawn book is the text we just read before, that it was Sefer Bifnei Atzmo v'Nignaz. But this text says that the two verses came from a book called the Prophecies of Eldad and Medad. That's one of 24 books that the Tanakh mentions that we don't have. But the point is that it provides an answer to the question, where did this independent text come from? It was an obvious question that Chazal had to ask at some point. It's recorded here in Chaserot v'Yaterot, and it has a very interesting answer. It came from the text of Eldad and Medad, the prophecies of Eldad and Medad, because the Torah tells us there was a book in which the events of Eldad and Medad, who were prophesying outside the camp when the elders had gone elsewhere, the Torah says there, V'hema b'ketuvim. In the middle of this verse that tells us that the Spirit rested upon them and they were prophesying, it says, they are in the annals. My translation, but it means literally, they are in the written texts. That's why Chazal say that there was a book called the Sefer of Eldad and Medad, and it's the source of these 85 letters. Fascinating aside, there's much more to say about that, but it's part of the history here. Here comes High Gaon at the end of the Gaonic period around the 11th century. He's really the most famous Gaon. He's responsible for a huge watershed in Jewish law and history. And he gives us some more information about the markings in his day. They are, and he's not talking about, the Gemara where he makes this gloss is talking about writing symbols on Shabbos that aren't letters. And he says those would be letters not known in a script because they're called symbols in the space, like the inverted nuns, which are written at Vayihi bin Soha Ha'aron. And he says, symbols in the spaces, simanim be'alma, and he calls them nunin hafuchin, and we're going to get to that in a minute. This is a huge change in the whole position here. They're described. The markings have now been described as something other than dots, and they are in the spaces. Very important that Hai said that. Just a break here. All my sources come from these places, and almost everything I have in what is a huge amount of literature and images are all public domain. You can go find any of these images that I'm going to show you in these places. The Vatican was a vast storehouse of information. The Jewish National Library in Israel, Robarts has an amazing collection. The Hebrew U has a database of all the manuscripts of everything. So all of the stuff is readily available. It just has to be sought after, and that becomes part of the hunt. For images, I was looking for copies of Sifrei Torah or codices. Those are parchment books that exist in university and collected libraries all over the planet. Librarians were very willing to help me. Scholars have been very willing to help me with things I couldn't readily find. But all of this stuff is no secret. I want to say a point here that may bother a lot of people. It bothers me a lot. A good portion of this work is deciding to ignore the bad calligraphy that might be the source of the evolution of the markings. Changes in the script of markings in Sifrei Torah might be because scribes were not good artists, and they certainly weren't practiced at making markings outside of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet that go in a Sefer Torah. Other than those letters, these are the only other real markings in the Sefer Torah. So here's a great example to start us off. This is the famous Aleppo Codex. This is the Bible that Maimonides himself said was perfect, massoretically, textually, vocalization was perfect. This is the paradigm. We don't have it all anymore. Some of it disappeared just before the state was created. But we don't have the inverted nuns from Numbers. We have them from Psalm 107. You can look this up in your own Tanakh. They will be there. There are 7 inverted nuns almost in a row. They're up and down here, top part of the page. It's not at all clear why they're there. There's very, very, very little, almost nothing written about these in the literature. But I want to show you the bad calligraphy here. If you walk your eye down each of these nuns, I admit, they all look marginally the same, but just look at this top two, these top two. Yes, they're dotted. There's a huge difference in the crown shape of the two of these. Go to the third one, and it morphs again into something else that's recognizable as an inverted nun, but it's not the same as the second one, nor is it the same as the third one. The bottom one is really very different. It's got this crook in it. So it looks like the scribe is trying to go back left after he's been right. I believe that this is careless, this is poor practice, but it's problematic because of what you're going to see as we move forward. Remember, bad calligraphy. Here are some manuscripts that you've seen before and some new ones. I want to point out that early on, this is the 11th century, maybe earlier. All of these things took very long to write and vocalize, so it's likely that we're seeing traditions that are already hundreds of years old in these manuscripts. Notice how these first two, Michigan and Damascus, are very similar to each other, while London and Leningrad are similar to each other, but a very different marking. That's significant for the evolution here. This is early textual evidence of the difference or the watershed in directions these markings are taking. This is the piece that made me fall in love with this study. This is a rarely known text called GINZEI Mitzrayim. It appeared at the same time as the Dead Sea Scroll, as the Cairo Geniza materials started coming out at the beginning of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. And it is an introduction to the Bible. If you were to go buy an introduction to the Bible today, it would cover many of the topics that this document from the 11th or 10th century covers. It's written in prose, it's beautiful Hebrew, it's relatively easy to read. And it was the first manuscript that replaced a transcribed published text that I discovered. I probably had to write away to the seminary in New York to get this because some things aren't quite online yet. But it showed me these images, this images of the markings. So this text around here is explaining what they mean. We'll get to that in a second for a minute. But it provides a diagram from someone who was writing, hopefully, an accurate introduction to the Bible as to what these markings looked like in his community. And we know from here that we see the markings in those various manuscripts that look very much like this. Notice that they're dotted. So GINZEI Mitzrayim says, I'm reading here in the second line in the middle, that God inverted these markings to reflect the position, to reflect an attitude that God had uprooted, turned over, turned backwards and upside down the anguish of the journey that the people were on in the desert, so that they wouldn't become frustrated by it. Shelo yitzta'aruba. And then the manuscript, the printed manuscript, has these markings drawn like this. It always bothered me that they were so straight and clean, but for decades I had to work with them as that. I knew they were there. I had to make sense of the text that these were embedded in. The text continues. Like those things who go down to the sea in boats do their work. And I added in with to make sense of that. These markings are like the things that they who go down to the sea and in boats do their work with. And you can quite easily see that in the Hebrew, ki yotzei bo yordei hayam be'oniot osot melacha. So I think that that's what that means. And then it dawned on me that there's something else going on here. Yordei hayam be'oniot osei melacha b'mayim rabim is the pasuk in Psalms 107 that has the first inverted nun. So the author of GINZEI Mitzrayim is telling us that the markings that are in the Sefer Torah look like things that people who go down to the mighty waters to do their work, to ply their trade, use. It took me a very long time to figure out what that was referring to, and it finally dawned on me that we're talking about fish hooks. And the author of GINZEI Mitzrayim is saying, these things look like fish hooks. Number 5 is a particularly good example. If you look at number 4 up here, they've even got the dots on top. I'm not saying this is the fish hook that the guy had in mind, but these are medieval fish hooks from approximately the time of GINZEI Mitzrayim, and he uses them to describe what these markings should look like. And they do look like fish hooks. As you can see in the top right, there's a fish hookness to these. This little discovery here was enough to make me say, if I can keep doing this kind of research and finding this kind of neat stuff over and over again, I could spend my whole life doing this. The kicker was that the word nun in Aramaic means fish. So this is a perfect circle of rabbinic interpretation using an illustration found in the Chumash. No one ever told you before there were illustrations in the Chumash. This is just one of them. We're going to get to another one soon. So here you have an 11th century Geniza document with pictures of fish hooks telling us why the Sefer Torah looks like that. Of course, we have to get to Rashi. Rashi is another major player in this. He says, quoting the Gemara, that God made marks in front and behind this text in order to indicate this is not its proper place. We've heard that already. Rashi quotes the Gemara all the time. No big deal. Why was it written here? Again, he quotes the Gemara to distinguish between two tales of punishment or calamity, and we've heard that before. So Rashi brings in a scientific remark at the beginning. They're there because it's not its place, they're editorial marks. And then he provides a literary interpretation that says they were put here these verses were put here specifically to cause you less emotional difficulty when you're reading these two stories. A very interesting comment, which to my mind always meant Rashi was really sort of chickening out here about telling us what these really were. There's a whole chapter in my book about that, but there's more to this. Rashi also commented on the inverted nuns where they appear in the Gemara text in Shabbos. And he says there they are to differentiate it from adjacent text. We already heard him say that. They're at the beginning and end of Vayhi bin Soah Ha'aron. That becomes a critical piece in the history here because you can't be clearer about what Rashi says the location of the markings is. They're Batchila Uvasof, the beginning and the end. I can't imagine how anyone could interpret that differently, but just wait. And he also says this in Rosh Hashanah, where they're talking about, again, Sabbath violations, about in writing marks. He says the marks you're not allowed to make are things like the simaniot, the symbols, which are, Rashi says, bein pasuk pasuk, between the verses, there are simanim, symbols, hafuchin. We'll get to what that means in a minute. And, by the way, the text says that Rashi text says there's a drawing there of these markings. I've never seen a manuscript for that, but I'm still looking. So the point here is that he says they are hafuchin. Well, we all think that means inverted, but how do you know it doesn't mean reversed, meaning backwards, facing backwards? There's no way to know whether Rashi means inverted or reversed. He could mean that's backwards. He could mean it's upside down. Hafuch has no definition. So when you say it's a siman hafuch, what siman are you looking for? That siman isn't the name of a character that's definable as anything but not a letter. Any scribble is a siman. So Rashi's not really left us with a whole lot more information than we didn't already know, but he's very influential, obviously. Rashi is Rashi. So there's four things Rashi says. They indicate that it's out of whack. There's been a transposition, separating tales of calamity and punishment. They're before and after the text of Numbers 10, 35, and 36. And they are reversed, or I'm going to call them reversed symbols here for a while, simanin hafuchin. So we continue a little bit to analyze these inverted and reversed so you can recognize them. Here you see a symbol inverted. All that is a nun flipped upside down, top to bottom. Below, it's reversed, back to normal, and then flipped laterally so that it's facing backwards. There's also, you're going to see an inverted and reversed symbol, which looks like that. So you've got all four possible combinations, permutations of the orientation of this to recognize and deal with. So there's 1,000 years of interest in this that we've quickly gone through. What's the purpose of these markings? We have good questions. We have some answers. What do they look like? Maybe they're dots. Maybe there's something else. It's not clear. Where are they? Rashi was unequivocal about them being before Vayhi bin Soah Ha'aron and after Alfei Yisrael at the end of the 85 letters. And what do they mean? Because there always has to be meaning for everything in the Torah. That's where I leave you tonight so that we can have a few minutes of questions and discussion, and I can tantalize you with another hour of this in a few weeks. So I'm going to stop the screen share and go back to my screen and see your faces and nothing in the chat. So I'm opening it up to questions and comments. Questions, comments? Someone's got to have a hand up. No, nothing?
Sholom, it was fascinating. Fascinating stuff. That's what I will say. That's my comment.
I've set you up for all the pictures because you're going to understand the pictures now. You'll see. Questions?
Sholom.
Yeah. Who's speaking?
Morris.
Morris.
For some
Hello.
reason, I can't see my face anymore. It says I'm recording something, but I don't want to be recording. Anyway, the question is, are there any other kinds of inversions like this? A chaf, any other inversion?
Yes. I mentioned there's the inverted nun in Haran, which we can see historically, but doesn't appear in any scrolls today, kosher scrolls at least that I know of. There are several inverted in letters here and there throughout history. They come and they go. Nothing that is as significant and as well recorded and documented as these inverted nuns, these inverted markings. They're not necessarily nuns, that they look like nuns.
Okay. One other comment, when you showed those Greek C's, they look like the beginning of parentheses, which is how we tend to use parentheses.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of people look at the inverted nuns cold and say, oh, they're brackets. Exactly. Brackets could come from the exact same place. Brackets mark out a text about which there's something special to note. That's easy. Yeah, for sure.
Hello?
Yep.
Question. Have you checked, I mean, is the Cairo Geniza accessible? Can you actually go through all the, I know that Dove, what's his name, Dove Friedberg is actually computerizing everything that's found there. So have you had a chance to go through it all? Is it possible you'll come across something that will be really revealing?
I have several images from the Cairo Geniza, radically different from each other, that are ready to show you in 2 weeks. The Cairo Geniza is really easy to search through. I found two things of interest from a beginner's search. There's some more work to be done, but I think I obviously don't know what I didn't discover, but I've got representation from the Cairo Geniza. I have representation of markings from, I believe, every century since, depending on what the Aleppo Codex represents, the 9th century. Every single century has something new or innovative or interesting to look at vis-a-vis the markings.
This is worthy of a book.
It's in process.
Well done.
Right. One other question?
Sure.
Just out of curiosity, why the nun?
Yeah, why do you know?
Well, it's not a nun.
Right.
It's a sigma. It looks like a nun. By the time Chazal commented, my theory, by the time Chazal commented on this in the Talmudic period, they had already lost the knowledge of where it came from. They didn't lose what it meant. They said it marks a text that needs to be in a different place. There's some other things it could mean too that are relevant, but it marks a transposed text. They didn't know that it came from the Greek world. They just knew that it was in the Sefer Torah. So it's slavish copying, and they call it a nun because it looks like a nun, whether it's a nun shape at least, whether it's reversed or not. And remember, in Midrash MISHLÉ, it said that it was a space, a shofar-shaped object, or a shofar-shaped object, which sort of seals the deal about it being round-ish. And there are three letters that they could use to describe a roundish character. It could be the nun, it could be the resh, or it could be the chaf, and that's part of the story later, which I won't get into much. But they somehow, eventually, very soon in our story, they become known as nunin, hafuchin, and almost nothing else, because of the nun shape that went from this to this. So it's not really a nun, we just call it that. David?
Okay,
Tom?
thank you.
What about the Digalim? What do you think about that it belongs with the Parshat of Digalim?
A stab in the dark because conceptually or contextually it would fit there. Maybe that's the place where it was transposed from, but they didn't leave a mark there. I never did the count, but there is a medieval who says that it was a nun because the parsha of the 85 letters should be moved 50 parashot back, 50 pieces of text back, which might be around the story of the Degalim, as Chazal say, but no one ever said it really works out like that. The parshiot would be different in any Sefer Torah anyway.
Oh, fantastic.
So the presentation in 2 weeks is mostly images. I have to say that behind all of this, from the years 1200 through now I'm working in the 17th century, there's a vast halachic literature that includes parshanut and symbolism. I'll tell you about the Zohar, which took me literally 40 years to figure out, but now I understand much more about why what happened to this tradition happened. It's a fascinating story, the Zohar. And then the whole thing breaks open to there to where pretty much any permutation and combination of marking and position and shape can be found in the documentary evidence. If you want to scribble what you might want to do to which nun of the 85 letters, I can probably pull out a text of the Torah that looked like that at one point. And that's part of the story here, why and how and who and what. And I leave that for 2 weeks from now.